Tonight on Nation to Nation, Mandy Gull-Masty talks about her appointment as the new Minister of Indigenous Services Canada, the first Indigenous person to hold the position.
It's time that somebody has this seat. Somebody with a different lens, a different perspective.
Pam Palmater on Mark Carney's new cabinet.
I like how he's mixed. Here's some of the old guard with all of these new people.
Leah Gazan on the future of the NDP after the party's worst historical showing in the recent federal election.
I think it's an important time for us to reflect and analyze what happened during the election and how we wish to proceed forward.
Welcome to Nation to Nation. I'm Fraser Needham. It's been quite a few weeks for Mandy Gull-Masty. On April 28th, she was elected as the new Liberal MP in Quebec's Northern Riding, knocking off the Bloc Québécois incumbent in the process. Earlier this week, Mark Carney appointed Gull-Masty as the new Minister of Indigenous Services Canada, making the former head of the Crown Council of the Crees the first Indigenous person to hold that portfolio. Mandy Gull-Masty joins me in studio today. Welcome to Nation to Nation, or welcome back, I guess, because we talked a few weeks ago.
Thank you. Thank you for having me in person.
Right, yeah, nice to see you in person. So I guess obviously lots of changes in the last sort of 48 hours for you, but one of the things is you are the first Indigenous person in ISC. Now, some have said that, that have said a First Nation person shouldn't hold that portfolio, or the demands will be obviously very high. And how do you feel about that, or how will you balance that, I guess?
I think that it has been a whirlwind of a week, first I'll say. I was very honored to be selected to be part of cabinet. When I received the news what my ministry would be, I wondered and thought, you know what? It's time that somebody has this seat. Somebody with a different lens, a different perspective. I'm going to try my best to deliver service to Indigenous peoples with a new approach. That's really my objective.
Now, one of the interesting things about this new cabinet, there's 3 Indigenous people in it, but also there's 4 Northern MPs in this cabinet, including yourself, which is really that nothing like that has ever happened before, that actually have Northern MPs in cabinet in this way. What do you think that means for the government or the direction?
I think it means 2 things. First, it's a strong message from the Prime Minister, being sure that there is diversity, that there's representation at the cabinet table. And, he's said it many times, the economy was the driving issue in the campaign, infrastructure and how that's going to look, where it's going to be developed. It's going to take collaboration, it's going to take cooperation, it's going to take a lot of learning. I see that we have the opportunity to shape and inform the path that will move those discussions forward. And I'm really proud to share that space with other Indigenous peoples, and that we're all from the North.
Right, you mentioned sort of the economic focus, obviously, of Mark Carney. That's going to be sort of the new government. One thing he's talked about is a little bit about, moving the evaluation process for pipelines a little quicker, has talked about east to west pipelines. And of course, talk about balance. You're in Quebec, of course, where pipelines have been a bit controversial, plus also have a lot of Indigenous people that has to be balanced with. How will you balance that, I guess, as part of your role in cabinet?
I think it's a good question. There's a lot of dialogue going on in the Premier's table with the Prime Minister. This is where I think we will hear that initial feedback. Everybody who is responsible for those files, I think, will be able to answer that question, be able to provide direction. We have a retreat. We will receive our mandate letters. Once that process has been undertaken, this is where I think we will have more of a clearer picture on what the pathway forward is.
Right, and of course, from the last government, there's a lot of commitments made, but a lot unfulfilled. There's some, sort of angst out there in Indigenous communities that things weren't moving fast enough. So there's a number of issues still on the table, like water, child welfare, long-term reform in child welfare. What in the new government, is there anything in particular that you think that, in terms of Indigenous issues, that the government needs to sort of move on, perhaps in its first sort of 100 days or so?
I think that, of course, there's many that they need to move on. The commitments that the Prime Minister is going to make in his first 100 days will come from his office. As one of the ministers, of course, I'm going to push to make sure that my files and my colleagues' files are part of those first 100-day commitments. But I have already had numerous messages from leadership, from communities, from other departments. Here are the things that need to be addressed quickly. For me, I'm in the process of getting installed. I'm a new minister. I'm a new deputy. I have 2 jobs. I have a lot of learning. It's a very steep learning curve, but I've already received my briefings, and I have been a recipient of some of these services. So I think that's going to give me the advantage to be able to push quicker and to be able to come into this space with knowledge and understanding of what is expected.
Now, one of the other issues, of course, we covered quite closely was the child welfare reform. They had a sort of a deal that went before the AFN and it failed. Started to move ahead with Ontario, but it seemed that the Prime Minister gave indications that he was willing to sort of, sit down with each of the regions to work out a deal. Is that something you think that will happen in the near future, or how do you see that playing out?
I heard his commentary during the campaign period. He was open to returning back to the negotiating table in good faith. I'm fully supportive of that. I think one of the advantages that I have, having been in a position of negotiating and supporting negotiations, is really setting those terms of how we're going to dialogue and what the expectation is. So I believe that these are one of the things that we'll hear coming out, from his office very shortly.
Right. Of course, another new thing is the Secretary of States, that there's 10 of them. Have you been given, I know you just had one cabinet meeting, but have you been given any indication of how you as ministers will work with these Secretary of States? For example, like we just were talking about Buckley Boulanger, he's in rural development, or people like that. How will that all work?
I've had the chance to meet the Secretaries of State. They did come to Cabinet. We had a very brief dialogue. It was more focused around where we are going to go as a government. We have a Cabinet retreat. I think this is where those pressing questions like clarifying what the mandate is, how to support, who's going to go where, what responsibility will look like. These will become clear in the next couple of weeks. You have to remember, government is setting up. It is a new government. It is a new Prime Minister, a lot of new faces around the table. So we are all working together, collaborating, and being sure that we're prepared for when Parliament opens.
Now, of course, we talked about this the last time we were discussing, of course, of this massive riding that you have and all these different communities, and that, of course, now you're going to be a minister as well with a very busy portfolio. So have you thought a little bit about how you actually balance that all, I suppose, with, which is always limited time?
Mm-hmm. I think my advantage is I have a really good network in my riding. I have a very personal and direct relationship with a lot of the leadership. I've reached out to some of the mayors, to some of the Grand Chiefs, to the leadership in the North, and I want to ensure that they know when I'm in Parliament, my role here is to represent them. So being able to prepare, being able to be supported by them and what their needs are, and having that, presented as part of my role as an MP is important. But I think that because I have, a lot of Indigenous, Inuit, and members in my riding as well, the workload will also spill over. So having my staff in place, having my riding offices open, it's really what I'm focusing on right now, to be sure that people understand that when I am not in Ottawa, my intention is to be present in my riding. I have many people to serve. I have 2 roles. I take them incredibly seriously.
All right, so we'll have to end it there for time purposes, but thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Miigwech.
Up next, we'll talk more about Mark Carney's new cabinet with Toronto Metropolitan University professor Pam Palmater. Welcome back. Mark Carney has framed his new cabinet as one of change and setting a new direction, but a number of ministers who served under Justin Trudeau have reappeared in his cabinet and in front bench roles. This includes François-Philippe Champagne in Finance, Sean Fraser in Justice, Anita Anand in Foreign Affairs, and Patty Hajdu in Jobs and Families. It also remains to be seen how much of a focus Indigenous issues will have in the new cabinet and government. Today to talk about it all is Toronto Metropolitan University professor Pam Palmater. She joins me from Toronto. Welcome back to Nation to Nation.
Thanks.
All right, well, so I have to start off with this new cabinet that they're projecting change, but, still a lot of old faces in there. So is it change, or is it sort of the same old Trudeau cabinet?
Well, there's always going to be some similarities between previous cabinets. You don't want to totally erase all of the historical memory and experience and things like that. I like how he's mixed. Here's some of the old guard with all of these new people. I think there's like a bit more new people than there are old. And I also really like that he's even changed how he's doing it. So it's a smaller cabinet. You've got these secretaries of state. So he's making it, there's a lot less fluff and a lot more focus. So, I mean, who knows at the end? It always depends. The measure is what they do and how they do it and how well. But I do like the change. Plus, I mean, having this historic number of First Nations people in the governing party is pretty unique, I guess.
Right, and a number of them put into cabinets. They got three Indigenous, I guess, two Indigenous members in the cabinet, and then there's the Secretary of State. So another Buckley Blanger is the Secretary of State. So and they have a total of four Northern MPs in the cabinet. So what do you think about that? The way he's kind of structured that, in the way with having a strong role, I guess, for Northern Canada.
Well, I think there's two things. One, people were a little worried about whether Carney would have any kind of Indigenous priority. And I think having four in these leadership positions is very important. I think it's probably a signal that, we're still going ahead with Indigenous priorities. But then the second thing is what you were talking about, really, this Northern focus, because as soon as he was elected head of the Liberals, in his first week, he heads straight to the Arctic to talk to people in the Arctic about, social programs and services and housing, but also how do we defend the country in the North. So that was kind of the first hint that there would be a Northern focus. So who better to have in those positions than to have people from the North, because high numbers of Indigenous peoples in the North, and only people from the North truly understand Northern issues and what will be required to get things done. So it makes sense if the North is going to be sort of a renewed priority.
Now, of course, Mandy Gull-Masty, who's First Nations, is also the, I guess, first Indigenous person to take over Indigenous Services Canada. Now, do you think that puts her in maybe a little bit of a difficult situation? I know that job had been offered to Judy Wilson-Raybould, and she said she didn't want to be responsible for, that would put her in too difficult of a position. But how do you think that puts Mandy Gull-Masty, I suppose, taking over, which is the sort of the money area of Indigenous issues?
Well, I mean, it's interesting that Jody Wilson-Raybould would say that, because being the head of Justice Canada, it's the most litigious, aggressive department that impacts all departments. It wouldn't just impact Indian Affairs. So I'm not really sure about those comments, but in terms of having an Indigenous person, us as First Nations, we're going to be divided on that. There's many people who are celebrating and have been long calling for the least you could do is have an Indigenous person heading Indigenous Services Canada. And then there's others who are saying, like, she's not going to have enough flexibility to do what needs to be done at Indigenous Services Canada. So it's always a 50-50 toss-up. I'm a supporter of having people on the inside and outside. If you look at the work she's done for the Grand Council of the Crees, she's a very powerful woman. I mean, she knows everything about law and policy and how to get things done on a wide range of fronts. So, you have to give people a chance and see how they go. I'll be the first to criticize if she's just going down the same old path. But hopefully with this new set of faces, that won't be the case.
Now, of course, there's so much unfinished business from the last government. There's water, child welfare issues, a lot of things. It's going to be a short sitting of Parliament as they come back. What do you think the government needs to sort of get to work on first out of these many priorities that have not been accomplished?
Well, I think it won't be a choice of things. I think it will be very important to continue along the path of certain things. So they were already working on water, keep working on that. Don't slow that up. In fact, speed that up. And things like the settlement for long-term reform in child and family services, that those negotiations need to keep going. Other legislative provisions that they have around removing sex discrimination from the Indian Act, they just need to keep those going. So it's not like they have to kind of think of new things. And then they really have to sit around the table and think, okay, we need to figure out how to work better with First Nations. on anything that has to do with any kind of development on First Nation lands. Get there early, before decisions are made, make sure First Nations are a part of it, and decide what projects can go ahead and what shouldn't go ahead, or which one should go ahead with mitigation factors to lessen or remove any damages. And I think that's going to be probably the single most important part to eliminate the conflict that usually happens around the country when you don't talk to Native people about their own lands and their own constitutional rights on their lands.
All right, well, we'll have to end it there for time purposes, but as always, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thanks so much.
Up next, we'll talk to Winnipeg NDP MP Leah Gazan about Carney's new cabinet and the future of her party. Welcome back. The 2025 federal election was not an easy one for the NDP, in a campaign that was dominated by which party leader can best stand up to U.S. President Donald Trump and his threats of tariffs and annexation. The party was reduced from 24 to 7 seats and just over 6% of the vote, for its worst showing in history. On a brighter note, First Nations Winnipeg MP Leah Gazan is one of the NDP members who held on to her seat, and she joins me today from the APTN studio in Winnipeg. Welcome back to Nation, Leah.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, so before we move on to some of these other things, of course, a new Liberal cabinet announced yesterday under the new Prime Minister, Mark Carney. What are your thoughts on how he structured this cabinet?
Well, you know, I'm glad that after pressure from hundreds of women's and gender diverse organizations that he reinstated the Minister for Women and Gender Equality, something that a ministry he cut as the first order of business when he was first elected. But he continues on with his exclusionary cabinet practices. There's no Minister for Disabilities. There's no Minister for Seniors. There's just a Secretary of State. Labor, same thing for labor. This is deeply troubling. There's no Minister for Youth. All the groups that really require focused attention seems to be off the radar for this new Prime Minister.
Okay, and I want to sort of move to some of the Indigenous people appointed to cabinet. One of them is First Nations person, which is Mandy Gull-Masty, who heads up Indigenous Services Canada. Now, I'm sure you know that Joy Wilson-Raybould, that sort of, in her books, that position was offered to her, but she refused it because, for lack of a better word, she didn't want to be the Indian agent, I guess, and the person responsible for delivering the, sort of funding on behalf of the federal government. Do you think that puts maybe Gull-Masty in kind of maybe an untenable position by giving her that post?
Well, I just want to say, I want to congratulate all the Indigenous members of Parliament that have been appointed as ministers. I think that Mark Carney, however, needs to go beyond the gesture and show whether he's really serious or not. And that means providing these ministers with the means and resources to be able to do their job. When I'm talking about means, I'm talking about decision-making power, and resources, I'm talking about money. I mean, look at Jordan's Principle. It's one thing to say a whole bunch of wonderful things about Jordan's Principle, but let's be clear, the Liberal government cut back the funding on Jordan's Principle and the riding of Winnipeg Centre. This funding keeps people alive. So I think the onus is not really up to Minister Gull-Masty, it's up to Mark Carney to show that these appointments are more than just a gesture.
Okay, and obviously, of course, talked about in the lead up that Donald Trump played a really big factor in the election results and certainly the way things played out for the NDP. But what are some of maybe the other factors you believe led to the poor showing outside of that?
Well, certainly I think that, this is not the first time a political party has shown a bad showing. This has happened to the Liberals, it happened to the Conservatives under Kim Campbell, and now, unfortunately, has happened to the NDP. I think it's an important time for us to reflect and analyze what happened during the election and how we wish to proceed forward as a party in our rebuild. In saying that, you know, a lot of folks, I can say in Winnipeg Centre, I had pushes, waves from a number of different directions. One very strong wave was a fear of Poilievre and his anti-human rights agenda, in addition to the Liberal wave that we saw occur across the country. Let's not forget the Liberals were lower than the NDP. Before we went into an election. Politics is fickle. They now have a little less than a majority. But I think this honeymoon will not last long, especially in looking at Carney's new cabinet, where he has excluded populations from any sort of importance and any sort of focused ministry.
Okay, and just I know that the party, obviously, it's a bit of a blow, what's happened, perhaps a little bit disorganized, but I noticed from a Twitter post that you made that it looks like you found out about the new interim leader, Don Davies, through the media, which is probably not the way things should work. Is the party not, you know, or could they be doing better in terms of how they're handling sort of this transition phase?
Well, first of all, I want to say this has nothing to do with Don Davies, but I think, you know, as we spoke about, you know, this is a time for reflection. There's things in our party that needs to change. I think that certainly, regardless of if we agree on what that looks like, I think all of us are united in that we need to figure out how to move forward in a united way that really lifts up democracy, that lifts up the voices of all people. And in the case of other members around the caucus table, those members that historically have never had seats, including Laurie Idlout, myself, Jenny Kwan, Jenny Kwan, a racialized woman, and Laurie Idlout and I, both Indigenous women, the importance of ensuring equity and equality in those voices.
Now, of course, the Liberals, as you mentioned, are very close to a majority, about 2 seats away by last count, I think, and you know, what we're hearing, it's not surprising that they're approaching various members to cross the floor. Is that something that you would ever consider?
I was elected in Winnipeg Centre as a New Democrat. I've been a lifelong New Democrat. I'm not sure what conversations, I can't speak to that, certainly what kind of conversations are being held in behind closed doors. All I can say is that right now, I'm working along with caucus members and our party to push forward an agenda that respects democracy, transparency, accountability, truthfulness, and that's my focus right now in the rebuild of our party, but also for fighting for things that Canadians need. Job security, income security, affordable housing with rent geared to income. Those are some of the issues that I'm focused on in Winnipeg Centre and throughout the country, and that is my focus.
All right, well, I think we'll have to end it there for time purposes, but yeah, thanks very much for joining us. I know it's a difficult time, obviously, for the party, but you've always made yourself available to do interviews, so we really appreciate that.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
That concludes this week's episode of Nation to Nation. If you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcast at aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Fraser Needham. Good night.